Imagine this: a small country tucked away in northern Europe, surrounded by some of the richest and most powerful nations on earth. Yet it refuses to join the European Union, not once, but twice. Now here's the twist. While others thought this decision would isolate Norway and crash its economy, the exact opposite happened. Today, Norway stands as one of the wealthiest and most stable countries in the world. So how did they pull this off? How did a country reject the world's largest economic bloc and still become an economic powerhouse? Well, the answer is way more surprising than you might think. In this video, I'll break down the real story behind Norway's financial success and why its economy seems almost bulletproof even when the rest of the world is on fire. Let's dive right in. When we talk about rich and powerful European countries, most people automatically assume they are part of the European Union. After all, the EU is one of the world's largest economic clubs, a single market that's supposed to guarantee wealth, stability, and influence. But here's where Norway's story takes an unexpected turn. Not once, but twice, Norway was offered a seat at the EU table, and both times, the people said no. The first time this happened was back in 1972. At that point, the European Economic Community, which later became the EU, was expanding. Norway had the chance to join the bloc early, just as other European nations were rushing to become members. On paper, it looked like the perfect opportunity. But when the Norwegian government held a referendum, the results shocked everyone. 53.5% of Norwegians voted against joining. Fast forward to 1994, more than 2 decades later, the European Union had fully formed, the single market was up and running, and the global economy was changing fast. Once again, Norway held a national referendum to decide whether they should join the EU, and once again, the answer was no. This time by a slightly narrower margin, but still a clear rejection. So why would a country walk away from the biggest economic alliance on its doorstep? Twice. The answer is actually rooted in some very smart and very emotional reasons. First, it was about sovereignty. Norwegians believed that joining the EU would mean surrendering control over their own laws, policies, and economy to bureaucrats in Brussels. For a country that values its independence, that was a hard pill to swallow. Second, and probably even more important, were fisheries and natural resources. Norway's coastline is packed with some of the richest fishing grounds in the world. Joining the EU would have forced Norway to open up these waters to other European fishing fleets under common EU fishing regulations. That was simply unacceptable for many Norwegians, especially in rural and coastal communities whose livelihoods depend on the sea. And then came the oil. By the 1990s, Norway was fully aware of just how valuable its North Sea oil and gas reserves were. Giving the EU partial control over these resources, or even just letting Brussels have a say in the energy policy, was a major concern. Norwegians had seen enough examples of how other resource-rich countries lost control of their wealth, and they weren't about to make the same mistake. Finally, there was the broader fear of losing democratic control. The European Union, for all its benefits, is often criticized for its centralized bureaucracy and decision-making system. For a small, high-trust country like Norway, giving up even a slice of political independence wasn't worth the risk. So in both 1972 and 1994, Norway stood firm. It kept its distance from the EU even as almost all of its Nordic neighbors, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, signed up. But here's the million-dollar question. If Norway isn't part of the EU, how did it manage to stay so wealthy and in some ways even outperform its neighbors? Well, the answer to that is exactly what I'm about to uncover in the next part. Now, I know what you might be thinking. If Norway rejected the European Union twice, how on earth does it still manage to trade freely, stay connected with European markets, and stay this wealthy? Well, here's where the plot thickens. Even though Norway isn't officially a part of the European Union, it still enjoys almost all of the economic benefits through a little-known but brilliant workaround called the European Economic Area, or EEA. In simple terms, the EEA is like an EU-light membership. Norway, along with Iceland and Liechtenstein, joined this agreement in 1994. The deal allows these countries to be part of the EU single market, which means free trade of goods, services, capital, and even people across Europe. So when a Norwegian company wants to export seafood to Germany, or a tech startup in Oslo wants to hire developers from France or Sweden, they can do it without tariffs, extra paperwork, or major trade barriers. It's as if Norway is part of the EU family, just without the political drama. But here's the real genius of it. Norway gets the perks without giving up full control. Unlike full EU members, Norway doesn't send politicians to Brussels, and it doesn't participate in EU elections or decision making. Instead, it picks and chooses which parts of EU law to apply, usually when those laws affect the single market. And even though Norway has to implement a lot of EU regulations as part of this deal, it still keeps full sovereignty over sensitive sectors like fisheries, agriculture, justice, and foreign policy. Now, of course, there is no such thing as a free lunch. To stay in the EEA club, Norway pays a financial contribution to the EU. In fact, the country pays hundreds of millions of euros each year to support the EU's economic and social projects, even though it has no voting rights when the EU makes new rules. And you'd think most people would find that unfair, right? Pay but don't vote. But for Norway, this was a calculated trade-off. The cost of membership was small compared to the enormous wealth the country earned by keeping its businesses plugged into the European economy. In fact, some would say Norway pulled off the ultimate diplomatic trick. It kept all the economic perks of the EU, access to the world's biggest single market, without giving away its political independence. This quiet, behind-the-scenes deal has played a huge role in making Norway's economy as stable and as bulletproof as it is today. When we look at other small European countries that are fully in the EU, many of them are more exposed to EU-wide crises or forced to follow decisions they don't like. Norway, on the other hand, enjoys both freedom and connection, the best of both worlds. But the real foundation of Norway's wealth isn't just smart diplomacy. It's buried deep beneath the ocean floor. And that's exactly what I'll talk about in the next section. Now let's get to the real engine behind Norway's unstoppable economy, oil and gas. Back in the 1960s, Norway was just another quiet Nordic country. Fishing, shipping, and a bit of manufacturing made up most of its economy. People lived comfortably, but there wasn't anything particularly extraordinary about Norway's financial situation. And then everything changed. In 1969, a discovery was made off the Norwegian coast in the North Sea that would rewrite the country's future forever. The Ekofisk oil field turned out to be one of the largest underwater oil reserves ever found in Europe. For a country with a small population and limited industry, this was like winning the global lottery. From that moment onward, Norway went from being just another European country to becoming an energy superpower. Over the next few decades, Norway established itself as one of Europe's top suppliers of oil and natural gas. And it wasn't just about volume, it was about timing too. Norway built up its production capacity just as global energy demand was rising fast, especially during the oil shocks of the 1970s and the energy-hungry 1990s. But here's the real jackpot moment. In 2022, when the Russia-Ukraine war triggered an energy crisis across Europe, Norway became one of the most critical players in the continent's energy security. As Europe scrambled to find alternatives to Russian gas, Norwegian pipelines were already in place, feeding billions of cubic meters of natural gas to countries desperate to keep the lights on. In fact, some reports even called Norway the unofficial gas station of Europe during the crisis. This surge in demand led to record-breaking export revenues for Norway. The country's economy was flooded with cash, and its currency, the Norwegian krone, stayed resilient while the rest of Europe battled inflation and instability. It was almost as if Norway's economy was wearing an armored vest while others were getting hit by global shocks. But, and this is important, Norway knew early on that natural resources could be both a blessing and a curse. Many countries that strike oil end up falling victim to what economists call the resource curse. You know the story: corruption, poor planning, short-term spending sprees, and a total collapse when oil prices crash. Norway refused to fall into that trap. From day one, the Norwegian government applied strict policies on how oil money could be used. Most of the profits were channeled into what is now the world-famous Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, a massive national savings account designed to secure the country's future even after the oil runs out. So rather than blowing through its oil fortune like so many others, Norway turned it into a long-term economic shield, protecting both its citizens and its economy for generations. But here's the wild part. Even with all that oil money, Norway's real strength isn't just its resources, it's how wisely the country uses them, which we'll dig into the next section. So by now, we know that Norway hit the jackpot with oil and gas, but here's a question that separates Norway from almost every other resource-rich country on the planet. Where did all that oil money actually go? Most countries that discover oil follow a familiar and dangerous path. Their governments start spending like there is no tomorrow. Luxurious infrastructure projects, military toys, expensive welfare expansions, and in some cases, money simply disappears through corruption and bad planning. Economists call this the resource curse because the wealth dries up the moment the oil does. But Norway did something completely different. Instead of spending its oil riches as fast as they came in, the country played the long game. In 1990, Norway established what would become one of the smartest financial moves in modern history. The Government Pension Fund Global, GPFG, or as the world now knows it, Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund. The strategy was simple but genius. Every time Norway earned money from its oil and gas exports, the government wouldn't just dump that money into the annual budget. Instead, it would save most of it in this fund. Only a small calculated portion, typically around 3%, would be used to support the national budget each year. The rest would be invested in assets all around the globe, stocks, bonds, real estate, and other income-generating investments. And the results have been nothing short of astonishing. Today, Norway's sovereign wealth fund is valued at around $1.6 trillion. Yes, trillion with a T. That's not just the biggest wealth fund in Europe, it's the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. What makes this even more remarkable is how the fund is structured. The wealth isn't hoarded for the elite or locked away in government vaults. It's legally owned by the Norwegian people, and its purpose is clear: to safeguard the future for both current and future generations long after the oil wells run dry. And this right here is why Norway thrived while many other oil-rich nations stumbled. Countries like Venezuela, Nigeria, and even Russia all earned billions from oil exports, but without strict saving strategies, their economies became entirely dependent on oil prices. When those prices crashed, so did their financial stability. Norway, on the other hand, insulated its economy with the GPFG. Even when oil prices fluctuate wildly, the fund keeps generating returns. And since the government only uses the profits from these investments rather than the principal, the fund keeps growing over time. So while the rest of the world fights over short-term profits, Norway quietly built a long-term safety net for its citizens. A financial cushion so big, in fact, that every Norwegian is on paper already a millionaire in national assets. But here's the real twist. Norway's wealth isn't just about money in the bank. A big part of its success is also about how wisely it handles people, governance, and society itself. And that's exactly what we'll explore in the final section. Now here's something truly fascinating about Norway. It's easy to assume that a country this wealthy must have had smooth sailing all along, right? But the real test of any economy isn't when times are good. It's how well it survives when the entire world starts falling apart. And Norway has passed that test again and again. Let's rewind to 2008. The global financial crisis. Banks were collapsing, economies were shrinking, and unemployment was skyrocketing across the US, Europe, and Asia. Entire nations were pushed to the brink of bankruptcy, but Norway, it took a hit. Sure, like every other open economy, but it never came close to collapse. In fact, it was one of the first European countries to bounce back. Why? The answer comes down to a few smart fundamentals: low national debt, strong social welfare, and an ultra-stable banking system. While many countries were busy over leveraging their financial systems, Norway kept its banks on a tight regulatory leash. So when the global credit bubble burst, Norway wasn't drowning in toxic assets the way others were, and its citizens weren't left abandoned either, thanks to its robust welfare system. That safety net softened the blow for everyday people while the government could focus on stabilizing the economy. Fast forward to 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, the world stopped, businesses closed, borders sealed, economies worldwide went into free fall. Oil prices even dropped below zero for a moment, unthinkable for an energy exporting country like Norway. And yet once again, Norway proved its resilience. The government didn't panic, nor did it go broke trying to save everything at once. Why? Because of its secret weapon, the sovereign wealth fund we discussed earlier. When the economy needed support, the government calmly tapped into the fund's profits without going deep into debt, offering financial relief to businesses and workers, and keeping the country afloat during one of the most uncertain periods in modern history. And then came 2022, the Ukraine war. The global economy was already shaky, but the conflict sent energy prices soaring and created a new kind of chaos, especially in Europe. But this time, Norway wasn't just surviving the storm, it was benefiting from it. As one of Europe's main non-Russian energy suppliers, Norway's oil and gas exports boomed, sending billions in extra revenue to the government. All of these moments show that Norway isn't just lucky, it's built for survival. The country's model is a masterclass in balancing wealth, responsibility, and planning. Even beyond the numbers, Norway has something many nations envy: high citizen trust and strong governance. In Norway, the relationship between people and the state is based on mutual respect, transparency, and long-term thinking. When a crisis hits, Norwegians know their system will hold, and that confidence keeps the economy steady. But here's the real question: is Norway truly future-proof, especially in a world that's slowly moving away from oil and gas? Well, that's a debate for another time. That, my friends, is a story for another video. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell because this journey isn't over yet. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.